he will see this as wrenching survival out of the jaws of what looked like potential defeat. We shouldn't forget just how at different times in the past 3 years, Putin has very much looked on the ropes, whether it was because his own Wagner mercenary army mutinied, whether it's because, initially there were thoughts that the Russian economy could implode. As is, he's now been given the chance to actually grab something that looks like a victory of sorts. But although most Russians will probably go along with it, because frankly they're just happy for the war to be over, and if they have to claim to believe it's a victory, they'll say that that's what they believe. But I think everyone will know otherwise. But the idea that this then emboldens him to further attack, we still can't get away from the fact that Putin failed to defeat Ukraine, let alone NATO. That his war machine, or certainly his ground forces, are an absolute disarray.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined once again by Mark Galeotti, one of the world's leading experts on Russian crime and security. Mark, who was banned by Moscow in 2022, now heads the consultancy Mayak Intelligence and is an honorary professor at University College London and a senior fellow with the Royal United Services Institute and the Council on Geostrategy. He's also the author of more than 30 books, including his latest, Forged in War, A Military History of Russia from its Beginnings to Today. Mark, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be here.
We have a lot to discuss today. First things first, you have just got back from the Munich Security Conference. What a significant security conference that was. What are your key takeaways?
Yeah, it was in many ways quite a bizarre experience because, look, usually, in some ways, the key purpose of this conference, apart from all the behind-the-scenes wheeling, dealing and arm twisting, but it's to craft a message of unity, of Western unity. In this, it was precisely the opposite, because we've had not so much the 1-2 as the 1-2-3 punch of beforehand, in the week before at Brussels, Pete Hegseth, the American Secretary of State for Defense, basically coming out and saying Ukraine is going to have to accept that it's losing territory and that it's not going to be part of NATO anytime soon. Then we'd had Trump's own distinctive contribution, saying that he'd spoken to Putin and that they were actually going to start negotiations. And then we had Vice President J.D. Vance at the security conference. And look, I think everyone was expecting that there would be the ritual rap on the knuckles for Europe not taking its own security seriously enough. Maybe a little bit more vigorous than before. And instead, we got this extraordinary broadside in which he scarcely mentioned Ukraine, didn't mention trade wars and tariffs at all, and instead just piled into the West, into Europe, essentially saying how we were all bad Democrats and that he was very disappointed in us all. And that really set the stage, I think, because you had about a day of outrage and shock on the part of the Europeans there, and then an increasingly sort of belligerent and bullish mood, people saying that it's a wake-up call for Europe. How many times have we heard that, and how many times has Europe slapped the snooze button? Or else, in some ways, actually saying Europe must now accept that America is no longer a reliable ally and we will sort of push back. But the overall result then was that the message of the conference was not one of unity, it was quite the opposite. It was actually one of disorganization, chaos, and recrimination within the West, which, let's be perfectly honest, Putin and his cohorts must be basically ordering the popcorn and just sitting back and watching this glorious spectacle.
I mean, you've had some people say, is this the end of the transatlantic alliance even? Is that putting it too strongly in your view, or is that accurate?
Look, I think it is putting it too strongly, not least because, remember, Trump is going to be a one-term president. And although, yes, he has Congress sort of broadly on his side, a lot of the people who are even, Trump supporters nonetheless value the transatlantic relationship. There's all kinds of things that America benefits from as a result. This is more, I think, again, classic Trump negotiation tactics. He comes in very hard and heavy. He comes in with, basically making threats and making demands because he expects essentially to be haggled down. This is really geopolitics as handled by, a self-proclaimed art of the deal master. So, let's not overplay that. And I think this is one of the problems, particularly something like the Munich Security Conference. You cram together this critical mass of a couple of thousand delegates, 500 journalists in a very small, secure space. And inevitably, what happens is speculation and the desire to be a little bit more newsworthy, a little bit more outspoken than the last speaker sort of take over. We do need to have a bit more calm and a bit more distance, especially because this is actually an opportunity. And I know I'm rambling on here, but a bit of a soapbox issue for me. Look, I think what we're saying is maybe the old transatlantic relationship, which arguably has been out of date for a long time. I mean, so much of the talk of, for example, the UK-American special relationship gets overblown. This is a chance to craft a new one, which is perhaps a little bit more realistic and which requires particularly the European Union to grow up in terms of security and realize that it needs to take more responsibility for its own security in that way.
And do you think the message was starting to sink in over the weekend? You mentioned that Europe has had these wake-up calls in the past and continually presses the snooze button. Do you think this time the message has properly been heard?
As of Sunday evening, yes. But what I don't know is precisely what happens when everyone goes back to their respective countries, their respective offices, and in particular starts looking at all the other demands on their funds. Because when it comes down to it, politics is all about the allocation of resources. And we see the amount of angst that governments are handling, even just nudging up to and beyond the 2% of GDP defence figure that is the NATO minimum. I mean, the UK, we are over that, and we're talking about maybe bringing it up to 2.5. Well, this is nowhere near the kind of figure that would be needed, either in the short term, if we're talking about, for example, potential European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, but more to the point, in the long term, in order to ensure that Europe, whether it's just the European Union or Europe more broadly conceived to include the UK and a few other countries, can actually sort of defend itself on its own. So look, I mean, in some ways, I think this is the point. Give it a week, give it a fortnight, give it a month, and we'll get a better sense than what people are willing to say, in the bar on a Saturday evening.
Now, on the day we're recording this, European leaders are meeting for this emergency summit in Paris to discuss what to do in regards to Ukraine. And we've also got these talks taking place between the US and Russia in Saudi Arabia this week. Ukraine, of course, not represented at those talks. You wrote a brilliant piece for the Sunday Times over the weekend, Mark, in which you set out 3 possible scenarios for peace talks or a potential peace agreement. Do you mind just running us through what those 3 options are in your view?
Sure. I mean, I think that it has to be said that unfortunately, at the moment, the least likely is the comprehensive peace agreement that gives Ukraine that long-term stability and security that it deserves, and sort of locks it all in through treaties and the like. That is, in some ways, the best case scenario, but it's a long way away. The other 2 scenarios are based around ceasefires. One of them is just a very simple, plain ceasefire that is just literally that both sides stop shooting. So their forces are meant to stay in place, but this offers no real long-term protection for Ukraine. And it gives the total initiative to Putin, because he can decide whether he's going to spend a week regrouping and then start again, or a month, or a year, or just let the conflict freeze. But the point is the Ukrainians will never know. They, in a way, have to be at maximum readiness all the time, which is exhausting and expensive and politically impossible to sustain. And then there's the middle sort of scenario, which is, yes, it's a ceasefire rather than a true peace deal, but one that is buttressed with some kind of security guarantees, which the Americans have made clear will primarily have to be provided by Europeans, but which gives Ukraine a little bit more degree of protection and security, and will make it easier to also start the reconstruction of Ukraine. Now, for me, that kind of middle answer is probably the best that we can really hope for from these peace talks. We'll have to wait and see. To a degree, we don't know what Putin is going to be bringing to the table. But I think in the circumstances, the commonalities are that Ukraine is almost certainly going to be losing territory. And I always get into a lot of trouble whenever I say this. People say, well, that's not right. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's legal. I'm just saying it's likely to be what's going to happen. And there will be some continued support for Ukraine in terms of reconstructing, but also rearming it. Because I think in many ways it means that Ukraine's security posture in the future will be what sort of Zelenskyy has called the hedgehog approach. In other words, that it should be so spiky and spiny that the Russians won't try and handle it again. But again, I mean, it's very hard to guess because at the moment, as you say, even the talks we're hearing about, which are really talks about talks rather than anything
Mm.
else in Saudi Arabia, you know, in due course, Europe will have to be brought in to the discussion. And more to the point, Ukraine will, for all the fears, will essentially have a veto on what comes out of it. So we're at the start of a process, but it is an important start.
That's a very interesting point. So just to follow up on that point in particular, Mark, you think some of these fears that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump or Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio are going to carve up Ukraine without Zelensky even getting a say on what's happening, you think those fears are overblown?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine Trump sort of in the spirit of the moment thinking that's what's going to happen. It's going to be some new Yalta moment where the sort of the great leaders just look at the map and draw lines on it and so forth. But the point is that unless America is willing to go incredibly hard-nosed with Ukraine and essentially say, we are going to yank every single bit of support and we are going to make it harder for the Europeans to support you as well, then they probably won't have the kind of leverage to be able to force Zelenskyy into any kind of deal. It's quite striking, after all, that when Zelenskyy spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and I must admit, I felt that, I mean, he's always a very good performer, but looking at him before his presentation, you know, he looked a bit discombobulated, and he was not the only one there to look that way. But you know, his pitch was very much to Europe, and essentially saying, look, you know, America has abandoned you. You can't rely on America to protect you too. And that's a bit of a dangerous pitch because that may well be interpreted by Washington as disloyalty. Remember, Trump is this incredibly transactional figure. He more or less thinks, well, we have spent this money, or we have sort of provided this money to support Ukraine. They owe us. I mean, that's very much, you know, the way he has framed it in terms of why he wants America to have privileged access to Ukrainian rare minerals and rare earths. It's very much, again, this is the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated speaking, rather than the president of the United States. But in that context, I mean, I think that, you know, we have to come down to it. Zelenskyy is looking for leverage, and you know, we're likely to almost see a kind of a Zelenskyy-Europe alliance precisely to ensure that Trump and Putin cannot just simply decide how things are going to be and impose that on the ground.
Do you think Zelenskyy may get lucky in that sense, though? I mean, you've already had over the weekend Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, coming out saying, look, if needs be, we will have British peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine. President Macron over the past year or so has become increasingly hawkish. And now you've got the impending arrival of Friedrich Merz in Germany, who appears to be more hawkish regarding Ukraine and Russia than Olaf Scholz. So in a sense, might Zelenskyy get lucky by forging a stronger European alliance?
Yeah, up to a point. But first of all, we've got to realize this is also what Trump is essentially saying. I mean, the message very clearly put forward by Pete Hegseth was that America is not going to be the sole underwriter of European security. And in particular, if there's going to be security guarantees for Ukraine, then it's up to the Europeans to provide it. So in some ways, you know, Keir Starmer's announcement was just simply reflecting the word that was out of Washington. And there's also, I mean, a bit of a problem here in that certainly the Europeans very much are presenting their case for why they need to be in the peace talks as well. You're going to need us for the peacekeeping troops. The danger is we are in effect writing checks that our armed forces can't necessarily cash, particularly because, for example, the Poles have already said that they will not be providing troops. And the Polish military is one of the substantial, serious ones, especially because there's some massive levels of investment at the moment, because they're worried about their own defense and security. So, you know, the question is, now, some people are suggesting that you could get away with maybe at any one time 15,000 or so troops on the ground, 3 brigades, which would mean you'd need to have about 45, 50,000 troops assigned to the mission because these brigades have to be rotated. Zelenskyy himself is talking about 100 to 150,000, which again, by the same arithmetic, would mean you'd have to have 300 to 450,000 troops allocated to that. Now, okay, he's probably overbilling precisely because he expects to be haggled down. But nonetheless, I think we really have to appreciate the extent to which European forces have been hollowed out. And although European NATO as a whole has many more troops than the Russians, for example, I mean, in terms of total effectives, Europe, including Turkey, European NATO, it's got about 2 million troops. And you think, well, surely 2 million, you can find 45 to 100,000 out of that. But it's not that easy, especially when you haven't necessarily got the so-called enablers, the support, the logistics and so forth, which the Americans tend to provide. So there is a risk that Europe will puff itself up and say, well, of course, we'll provide peacekeepers, and then find its bluff being called, and either not being able to provide them or having to denude its other flanks. I mean, for example, for Britain to provide the brigade that is probably, it's about 5,000 troops, that is probably the sort of sum total. Well, the only way it can do that is by not providing a brigade that it had promised to Estonia to help Baltic security. There's no way really, unless there's some sort of extraordinary rabbit that can be pulled out of a hat. But there doesn't seem to be any way at the moment whereby we could be fielding 2 brigades at the same time. So there's going to be some very tough decisions to be made. And if we really sort of peg European commitment and European presence in the negotiations to peacekeeping troops, again, it's maybe a potentially dangerous gamble.
Mark, there are pro-Ukraine supporters of Donald Trump who argue that he's not actually trying to sell out Zelenskyy, that what he's doing is classic Trump, this is a negotiating tactic, and that he's seeing what can he get from Russia. And there was a release of an American prisoner last week that was instrumental in bringing these talk about maybe a renewed trade relationship between the US and Russia. That's what he's trying to get from Vladimir Putin, and he will leverage that against Zelenskyy. And what more can Zelenskyy offer? He's already talked about, give me $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals. Maybe he wants more still. Maybe he wants Europe to provide further security guarantees to relieve some of the burden of US military aid. Do you buy that argument that this is all just a big negotiating tactic from Trump?
I think everything is a negotiating tactic. Look, I think Trump does genuinely want to end this war. He regards it as not just a genuine humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, this is a man who keeps talking about the human costs, and although he has a tendency to exaggerate and change the numbers, nonetheless, I mean, there's no reason not to believe that that is actually the case. But of course, at the same time, he's seeing what he can get out of it. I mean, this is his administration's notion of geopolitics. Essentially, that every nation is out for itself, and everything is a game of zero-sum sort of negotiation. So from this point of view, he's using this, yes, to leverage the Europeans to actually spend more on defence so that America can pivot some of its forces out, particularly with an eye to what might someday happen in the Chinese theatre of operations. It's an attempt to see what he can get out of Zelenskyy. And there's this, let's face it, it's a fairly extraordinary move to say, all that aid that we've been giving you for years, well, we've decided that you now owe us for that, and therefore you basically should allow us to plunder your country. I mean, thoroughly colonial. But nonetheless, that's what's going on. And likewise with Putin, he is going to see what he can get. And, even the new interactions trade-wise, they are going to be ones that he thinks are going to be in America's interests. And so in this respect, everything is on the table. And I think this is the problem. We have a tendency to assume that both Trump and indeed Putin are grand strategists, that they have this very clear sense of exactly where they want to be and a roadmap for how they think they're going to get there. They're not. In their own way. And this is one reason I think why they can deal with each other, because despite the apparent differences, there are also great similarities. And one of them is precisely that they are opportunist tacticians. They create these unstable situations, which can go in all kinds of different directions, and then just see what happens. The same way as, likewise, Putin has advanced very maximalist goals for this war. Now, he must know that he's not going to get all of those. That doesn't matter. He'll throw them out because he expects to be haggled down, and he will, when the time he feels is right, try and see what the best deal that he can get. So this is two apparently very different, but psychologically quite similar deal makers, just seeing what the circumstances sort of allow them to get. But from Putin's point of view, he's focused on Ukraine. And from Trump's point of view, I think this is a much wider game, essentially about American dominance within the Western sphere.
Of those three potential peace deals, ceasefires that you ran us through, Mark, a kind of simple ceasefire, a more elaborate ceasefire, and then a more comprehensive peace deal, whichever one it ends up being, if it does end up being one, isn't the truth that Vladimir Putin will spin that as a victory and it'll embolden his regime further?
Spin, yes. I'm not convinced about the emboldened angle. Look, of course, Putin and his tame propagandists will claim this is a grand victory. Remember, Putin himself doesn't really think Ukraine exists. He sees this as a wider conflict with NATO and the West, and that's how they will spin it. Not only did we take on the most powerful military alliance in the world, but we have wrenched control over those bits of Ukraine which were, settled by Russian speakers, and we ensured that we can protect them against this neo-Nazi regime. All absolute nonsense, but nonetheless, sort of a plausible collection of lies. And I think, again, very hard to crawl into the deep, dark recesses of Putin's brain, but my suspicion is that more than anything else, he will see this as wrenching survival out of the jaws of what looked like potential defeat. We shouldn't forget just how at different times in the past 3 years, Putin has very much looked on the ropes, whether it was because his own Wagner mercenary army mutinied, whether it's because, initially there were thoughts that the Russian economy could implode. As is, he's now been given the chance to actually grab something that looks like a victory of sorts. But although most Russians will probably go along with it, because frankly they're just happy for the war to be over, and if they have to claim to believe it's a victory, they'll say that that's what they believe, but I think everyone will know otherwise. But the idea that this then emboldens him to further attack, we still can't get away from the fact that Putin failed to defeat Ukraine, let alone NATO, that his war machine, or certainly his ground forces, are an absolute disarray. An army which in January 2022 was configured for rapid combined arms, mechanized thrusts, is now essentially fighting a war where the basic unit is a dozen guys advancing against a tree line on foot. It's going to take years, and some people say 5 years. For me, I think it's going to be at least 8 years actually to reconstitute the army, assuming he can afford to do so. In that circumstance, whatever he may claim to the Russian media, the thought that he will actually think this is enough of a victory that I can then take on Europe, especially because, in 8 years' time, presumably, hopefully, Europe will have been arming itself and actually will be in a much more serious position. I still find that quite implausible, because when it comes down to it, from Putin's point of view, Ukraine was and is special. It's that piece of land that essentially he thinks, well, at least the eastern side of it, is Russian. He blames Lenin for having created a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at the beginning of the creation of the Soviet Union. He very much thinks that this is an artificial state. He's not said anything of the sort about Finland or Estonia or Poland or whatever. He may have grudges there, but he doesn't think they're rightfully part of Russia.
What about in 5, 8, 10 years' time, him moving on the rest of Ukraine, thinking, look, I see us all as one Russian people. I want to get rid of, whether it's the Zelenskyy regime then or the administration then, who knows? But, I want a different leadership in Kyiv. Is that more realistic than him moving, say, on one of the Baltic states?
Certainly more realistic. But again, if we say in that period, firstly, we don't know if Putin's going to be around at that point. Trump will not be around by that point. Remember, he's going to be a one-term president. And more to the point, look, the Ukrainians are not going to be sitting back in that time. I think it's very clear that the Ukrainians will be looking to arm themselves. And Zelenskyy himself has essentially alluded to the kind of strategic options that Ukraine has, which is if it's not going to be inside NATO with the Article 5 guarantee that embodies, or that it doesn't have essentially analogous guarantees, it may well be that Ukraine will feel it has no option but to go nuclear, but to actually build up its own nuclear deterrence of sorts, which Ukraine could do. So I think one way or the other, even if Putin has that plan, and I wouldn't be surprised, even with a ceasefire, he might be thinking of it just as a sort of temporary lull. But once you're actually in that situation, once you've got peace, once you're realizing that you're having to spend, at the moment, 40% of the entire Russian budget goes on defense and security. That is not sustainable in the long term. And it may be that he harbors such dreams, but I think in that 5 years or whenever period, I think he will realize that he's up against a much, much tougher Ukraine and may well be in an entirely different political situation.
On the nuclear issue, what timescale would we be looking at if Kyiv did seriously decide, you know what, the only effective guarantee of our long-term security is a nuclear weapon? How long would it take before they had an operational nuclear weapon?
I have no idea is the honest answer, because in part that depends on, obviously, the resources you throw in. In part, it depends on how ambitious you are, because again, you don't have to be thinking in terms of intercontinental ballistic missiles and such like. Just as long as you have something that can deliver a nuke into Russian territory at a suitable target. But also, we have to acknowledge that the degree to which this will cause a lot of dismay. It'll cause a lot of dismay in the West, as well as causing a lot of worry in Russia. Now, it may well be that it's actually something which, if it gets close to fruition, will, just as, for example, we saw with the Israelis, when they were looking at Iran's nuclear program, actually push the Russians into launching strikes to stop it. But I think part of the calculation of Ukraine is that if they start a nuclear program, it's not that they necessarily think that they are going to or have to complete it. It's more that that will be a shock to the West. And that may well be the West, forces the West to say, whoa, we would rather not see more proliferation, especially because if we close a blind eye to Ukraine doing it, it's so much harder to complain when North Korea or whoever else develop their programs. But also it might actually force the West to provide those kind of security guarantees that Ukraine so desperately needs and deserves. So there's just so many variables in this respect, rather than just simply saying, 3 years and they'll have this system.
Just to go back to the issue of the talks that are taking place at the moment in Saudi Arabia, do you think we're overestimating the chances of them actually producing any kind of credible deal? I mean, we were speaking on Frontline yesterday to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, formerly very senior in the US Armed Forces, and he was saying he thinks the Americans may quickly tire of the Russians and their intransigence and their reluctance to make significant concessions, and that therefore the Americans may come back to Zelenskyy and be far more favourable towards him. Do you think that's viable?
Yeah, well, we should not underestimate the Russians' capacity to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I know, for example, that there are people within the presidential administration in Moscow who are actually quite worried about Putin having a one-to-one conversation with Trump on the phone, because they were afraid that Trump might feel that he was being disrespected because Putin would overplay his hand or whatever. Now, in fact, Putin, it seems to be, was kind of masterful in his use of flattery and the like. But yes, there is ample opportunity for the Russians precisely to push too hard, to move too slowly. I mean, this is clearly something that General Kellogg, who is Trump's Ukraine representative, said at Munich when he was asked about the time frame. Said, this is operating on Trump time. Trump wants things done quickly. He wants to be able to do it, move, claim the success, ask for the Nobel Peace Prize, and then move on. So if the Russians look as if they're deliberately dragging things out because they think they're going to get a better deal or something, that may well basically turn things round and make Trump decide that the best way of getting a quick deal is actually to empower Ukraine and strengthen Ukraine to the point where the Russians think, okay, we need to compromise. So, we don't really know. And again, I apologize to you and your listeners that I can't give some more definite answers. I would love to be able to. But the bottom line is, particularly until we have seen the readouts from what actually happened in Saudi Arabia. And it's important to stress, as I said, that this is talks about talks. We're not expecting them to come out of Saudi Arabia with a plan that says this is how the war ends. But until we have a sense of quite how that works, then it's really too early to know.
Just finally, Mark, you do hear people who say, One of the reasons this is not the right time to have serious peace talks with Vladimir Putin is because the pressure is really starting to show on the Russian economy, that the ruble's value is falling, that inflation continues to be very high. They've got huge labour shortages in the economy, filled now with North Korean construction workers, among others, and that if you waited longer, Putin would be in a far weaker position. Is the weakness of the Russian economy overstated, or is that a fair point?
Yeah, I mean, the imminent weakness. I mean, the danger is this is always the kind of the one more push argument, which we saw go so disastrously badly in World War One, for example. Look, the bottom line is that the Russian economy is certainly struggling. It's heading towards stagflation, but it's operating. And an authoritarian regime like Putin's can, if need be, divert more resources away from butter and towards guns. I mean, I think there is a clear understanding that really this is probably the last year in which the Russians can operate at this kind of tempo of activity without having to make those really tough decisions. And in other words, without ordinary Russians beginning to really seriously feel the pinch. But the point is they probably got at least this year. And even then, it's not as though the economy is going to collapse and explode. It is just simply going to find more pressure. But the other key argument against this one more push line is that, I mean, the way I tend to frame it is precisely that the Russians are losing, but the Ukrainians are losing faster. We shouldn't take away from the fact that, in fact, the Ukrainian economy continues to a considerable extent to be on life support precisely because of the assistance it's getting. And above all, Ukraine is having trouble finding manpower for its army and to a slight degree for its economy as well. Remember, 10 million Ukrainians out of a population of just over 40 million are now out of the country or else within the occupied territories. So, I mean, I think that, yes, these are pressures which hopefully will actually push Putin into thinking this is the moment to really bring some kind of successful end to the war as he would see it. But if we're thinking that somehow there's going to be this deus ex machina from the Russian economy, which is going to mean that in 6 months or 12 months' time, suddenly we're in a position to have a much, much more Kyiv favourable deal, I think, again, that'd be a very dangerous gamble, primarily for Ukrainians.
Mark, we always appreciate your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Good to join you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, James Hansen. For more on the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts, you can subscribe or sign up for a membership for exclusive videos. And you can also get the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or from thetimes.com.